And I'm going to start, first of all, with a very quick overview of who lexiQA is and what we do. So for the rest of the presentation, after I tell you a few things about us, I'm going to show you how lexiQA works in MateCat's environment. So MateCat, as you know, is effectively the source for Kató, which is the platform used in Translators Without Borders. Because of a recent rehaul in the system in TWB, we felt it would be safer, let's say, to present in MateCat itself in order to avoid any particular instances where things might not be working properly. But either way, as you know, MateCat and Kató are effectively exactly the same platform. So everything you see today here will be directly applicable to your work with TWB. Now, after I explain how lexiQA works in two different scenarios, one would be how to use lexiQA's checks in translation, so while you're doing the translation work, but also during revision, which means after you have completed the translation. Then I'm going to tell you a few things about where lexiQA is at the moment, so explain how we work with languages, etc., what we have in place right now. And after all that, we are going to deal with the questions that may have come up during the presentation. So I'll follow up now with the first issue, which is what is lexiQA? I don't suppose most of you have heard of lexiQA before, so I thought it would be a good idea to start with a quick introduction. lexiQA is effectively a tool that has been developed for linguistic quality assurance with the philosophy of working entirely online. And that is why one of the first, let's say, integrations we developed with online translation tools was with MateCat. And that was almost 2 years ago now. Apart from this functionality that allows to integrate with online translation tools, we have also developed our own proprietary editor, which also operates online entirely. And that means that for any kind of workflow scenario where translation needs to be done online, then we can tag along and help with the quality assurance. This interoperability with other translation systems that work online means that if you have a platform for your translation work that works in the cloud, then whatever we do can just plug into the system you already have in place without intruding into your workflow. That means it's also going to be easier to use it because you don't necessarily have to train on a completely new desktop tool. It's something that operates in the environment that you are already familiar with. And because of this integration, you can use lexiQA for all sorts of projects, including obviously live translation work, as I'm going to show you in a moment, but also for translations that have already been completed. So if you have, for example, older projects that you would like to clean up, then you can go through your translation memories and use lexiQA's checks to go through them and verify that everything is all right. Now, some of the advantages of this kind of model of operation is the fact, of course, that you don't have to install anything new. It's all working in your own platform. And because it's completely online, it means that you don't have to worry about hardware requirements or operating system requirements. You just need a browser and you get QA during your translation. Another central part of our philosophy is the fact that we wanted to make sure that the noise that you normally get with standard quality assurance systems is minimized to a very low percentage. So we tried to apply, since the beginning, locale-specific checks for all the languages or the locales that we support in order to minimize the amount of so-called false positives. In other words, when you use a quality assurance system with your translation, it might find issues that are not actual problems. So it will highlight them as potential problems, but they're not actual problems. That's what we call noise. So by using locale-specific checks, we target the issues that have to do with your translation, the text that you're checking, and that means the accuracy of the tool is much higher by comparison. Now, the context of operating online and having a workflow entirely based online also means that you have a lot more interaction with your text, so you don't have to waste time moving from one application to another all the time. Everything happens in one place. That means you don't have to spend too much time training as well, and that also involves larger organizations. So we're not looking at just individual translators, of course. We're looking at also large organizations like TWB, who support very large teams of translators and revisers. So by consolidating everything in one place, it's easier to control what kind of information comes back and forth. And obviously the last point I want to mention here is the fact that having a more efficient system like this eventually means that you don't have to spend too much time doing the revision, because a lot of the revision work has shifted up or earlier in the workflow, if you like, meaning that the translator also gets to be a lot more involved with the QA. You don't have to wait for the translation to be completed before you can get to the actual quality assurance. So that means by saving time, you're also saving on costs. So that's the implicit benefit, if you like, of this kind of model. Now, I'm going to switch screens and show you exactly how our QA checks work in MakeCat. So I'm going to start, first of all, with a translation scenario. So this is basically a text that we have been kindly provided by TWB in order to use for this webinar. So this is an actual text produced in a project for TWB. And as you can see now, we have the source text on the left. We are in the translation editor of MakeCat. And as you would in a normal scenario, you have a suggestion in the translation editable area in the target text. And as you can see, we have some highlights showing up in the text. Now, these highlights could show up either in the target or in the source, depending on what the nature of the issue that has been found is. Now, in this case, we have a punctuation mark, as you can see here. We have a full stop in the source, which is missing from the target. Now, this particular tooltip, this box, is the information that lexiQA provides to this process. So basically, it's telling the translator, you know what, you've done all you've done so far here in the target, but you have forgotten to add a punctuation mark. So here at the end, if I add this punctuation mark, immediately the system will recognize that the correction has taken place and the highlighting will disappear from the source, which means that now, effectively, the translator knows that there's nothing wrong with this translation as far as these linguistic issues are concerned, and I can move on to the next segment. So basically, this is the kind of live QA interaction that you can get using lexiQA's checks in MakeCat's environment. To show you exactly how this kind of reaction would work, if, let's say, after this full stop that I just added, I also typed in by mistake a number like this. Now, this number obviously doesn't exist anywhere in the source, right? As you can see, this number 123, nowhere in the source text. So immediately after I typed it, lexiQA's checks kick in again, and the number is highlighted, and it's telling you the number was not found in the source text. So immediately you know that either this is something you did by mistake, therefore you have to correct it, or you did it on purpose and you want to keep it. And that gives you the option now. If you want to keep it, then you can ignore this error and say, I accept it. I know it looks wrong, but in fact, I know it isn't. Therefore, by making this choice, you're effectively telling the system that, you know what, I'll take responsibility for that one. Thanks for pointing it out. But it's my choice at the end of the day. And this also shows what the role of lexicon checks are, in essence, in this process. They are here to only help the reviser, or the translator in this case, to make informed decisions about errors that have been identified. Now, in some cases, these errors are issues that arise from actual linguistic issues that have been found in the text, but in some other cases, it might be a translator's choice, for example, or a reviser wants to change something for issues of style or for other reasons. In all these cases, there's nothing prohibiting the translator or the reviser to ignore such a highlight. But from our point of view, it's our responsibility to say that, you know what, I think we have a problem here, so you may need to look at it. So the highlighting is basically a visual cue telling the translator that an issue has been found, have a look at it, and if you think it's fine, then you can ignore it. But if you think it is an actual problem, then you need to go in the segment and fix it. And the moment you apply the correction, again, all highlighting disappears, and you can move on to the next segment. So let me show you now another example here where we have a date. Now, this is a numerical issue, of course. It's an issue of localization, in fact, to be more precise. So here we have a short date in the source text. And as you can see, this date should also feature in the target. But in the target, in the translation, the translator has chosen to use the long date format for this date. Now, one would think that should be all right. Why is that a problem? Well, one potential issue that might come up with quality assurance tools is when it comes to dates, especially in the short format, then we use 3 distinct numbers. And as you can see, the number 11 here is missing from the target text. So one might think, oh, that's the problem. So I need to use the short format here, even in the Spanish text. But that's not the case in this example. In this example, what we're missing here is the correct form of the date in Spanish. And now that the long date format is in fact accurate grammatically in Spanish, you can see that the highlighting for the date disappears from both the source and the target. And that's because we map date formats across languages in all the acceptable, from a grammatical point of view, forms that a date can appear. And we do that for all the localization conversions that apply in each case. So apart from dates, it could be units of measurement, could be units of currency, it could be, for example, timestamps. So in those cases, we would take into account what the grammatical rules are in each language, and we map them across the 2 texts effectively in order to make sure that in each case, the date in this example is mapped correctly. And the moment that that is done correctly, then obviously, as you can see, there is no problem, even though number 11 is missing from the targets. That's not a restriction as far as we're concerned. So and again, you have this live QA situation where the moment you apply a change in the text, the QA will kick in and will tell you if everything is all right or not. So again, here we can accept this translation, for example, and then move on to the next segment. Now here we have an issue with the tags. That's why the date has come up again. But if we move on, let's say, to another segment, like even the next one, let's say here, by mistake, we add another space, for example, before the comma. Now, normally you wouldn't get spaces before punctuation marks like that, unless the language requires it. So, for example, in French, you need to have a space before a double-pointed punctuation mark. We take all that into account, and if that were the case, we wouldn't be producing a highlight here. In other examples further down, here, for example, we have these brackets. Now, if by mistake I don't type this closing bracket at the end, but instead I type a square bracket, immediately you will see that there is a mismatch. So the system will tell you that you've basically mistyped one of the brackets in the text, and you can see that now the round brackets that were supposed to be here do not match. Therefore, you can see where the problem might be. You go in, you fix it. Now, all that is while translating still. So effectively, we have an additional partner, if you like, when it comes to improving on quality, and that partner is the translator. The translator becomes a lot more involved with this process, if you like. Now, there are some things that might be useful here for a translator to know. For example, this situation where, as you move from segment to segment, some suggestions might come up from lexiQA in the form of these highlights. Now, you might find, for example, in your own method of working, that you don't want to be getting these highlights while translating. So you want to get that deactivated somehow. Now, in the translation environment here in MakeCat, if you access the settings and you go to advanced options, you will see that the QA that lexiQA provides in MakeCat is active by default, provided that the language of the languages basically for the project you are working on are supported. And as you can see, we have quite a range. Now, if for whatever reason you don't want to be getting these suggestions on the fly while you're translating, you can always deactivate it. Now, that means any issue that comes up during the translation, so if, for example, I translate the next segment here, but I also add a punctuation that doesn't exist in the source. Now, as you can see, the system didn't react now. There's no highlights. And that's because we didn't activate lexiQA. lexiQA is now deactivated. Now, you can do this if you like as a potential alternative for your workflow, whereby you finish the translation work completely, and then you go back to the start of the text, you activate lexiQA's checks, and when you go back to your text, if something like that happens, then now you get a mark telling you that the punctuation shouldn't be there. So effectively, you run the QA checks that lexiQA provides retrospectively. That is something that some people might like to do. Generally, what we recommend in terms of workflow is that the live highlight will make you more adaptive, and it will also help you pick out any issues that come up the moment they arise, and that will decrease the number of errors that will come up during a translation. So instead of doing everything at the end, you can do it on the go. So the translation that you're looking at now obviously has not been completed, but we're not going to go through all the segments here to show you this. The main issues that I wanted to point out were the locale-specific checks, like the ones we saw with the date earlier, and the tooltip that comes up every time you have an issue, so that you can use the information in the tooltip to make a decision about what error you're dealing with and whether you want to correct it or ignore it. So that's the main functionality that you will need when it comes to a live translation scenario. Now, I'm going to switch over to a revision scenario where now, instead of looking at a live translation, we have a completed translation. So this translation is all done. As you can see, all the segments have been worked on. And now you can see that there are some highlights already in some of the segments. Now, I have to be upfront here. These were not actual errors in the text we received. I planted these errors on purpose so that I can show you exactly how the checks would work in a revision situation. Now, some of the errors that we're looking at here, some of the highlights are exactly the same as the ones we had before. I can show you some of the different ones that have come up later on. So let's say we're done with this and we're looking at this example here. Now here, exactly this issue here, we have a repeated word. This is normally an error, but obviously there are cases in various languages where there are many common repeated word structures which should be allowed. Now we have a database which we continuously update with a lot of these structures in various languages, but obviously generally the rule for us is we'd rather point something out and you ignore it rather than us ignore it and then you missing an error. So for us it's more valuable in terms of input to point out whether something is a mistake, and then by getting this feedback from the users as well, because you can always come back to us and say, you know, in Spanish, para should be acceptable, because there are situations where these two words can be repeated and it's not a problem. Then we are very happy to use that information to improve our checks in the background. In this case, I don't think this is an acceptable structure, so I'm going to delete the second instance of para just to show you how the highlighting also disappears. And in the example of the date, we also have a case where here in the date, we don't have an issue with the date format anymore, but rather we have a number issue. So here the date should be 28. Now the moment we change this, you can see immediately the highlighting disappears again. So this is something that happens on the fly, and it would happen for all the errors that have been identified in the text. Here's another example of a locale-specific problem in this segment here. Now, here you can see we have the punctuation mark for for a question in Spanish, but because this is a locale-specific check, we need to take into account that in Spanish, double-pointed punctuation marks also appear at the start, and they're also upside down, which means that now that we have addressed this potential issue, if we run the QA again for this segment, you can see that now the highlight in the ending punctuation mark has disappeared, because that is not an issue at all anymore. We have added the missing punctuation at the start of the segment, and now that is corrected. Now, another issue that I wanted to point out now is, while we've been doing this, in other words, going through every segment with any potential errors that have been found, there is a counter up here at the top right, which tells you that some issues have been found in this text. And this is the lexiQA counter here telling you that you have various issues that have been identified. Now, instead of looking at the whole text, if I want to only look at those segments where some problem has been identified, I can use the lexiQA toolbar here to jump to the QA report. And the QA report will basically break down only those segments which have some kind of a problem. And now, if I find a segment where I know what the problem is and I know how to fix it, I can even use the links on the left on the reports. So each of these segments has a link, and I can jump directly to that particular segment with this error, and now I can also fix it. So immediately the counter changes the moment I confirm the change has taken place. So basically the counter will give you feedback directly on the corrections that you're making. And generally, of course, you can use the QA report as well as a point of reference. If you want to communicate something with your project managers, you can just use this link from the QA report and send it off. And now everybody knows exactly what problems have been found during the revision. In the translation environment here, you can also use the navigation arrows to jump from each segment where a problem has been found to the next one, and to the next one, and to the next one. And that way you don't have to use the scroller endlessly until you find another segment where some kind of a problem has been identified. You can just use the arrows to jump from each problematic segment to another. And as a last point of reference here, I can also show you this, which is the QA documentation page, where you know exactly which types of errors lexiQA is checking for, and exactly how they are highlighted in the text and how they are described in each of the tooltips that you get for every error. So basically, this category here, the numerals, these are the locale-specific, not punctuation, conversions that I mentioned earlier, where you have, for example, decimal points that need to be localized, numbers to words in some cases as well, dates, like the examples I showed you earlier in the short format or in the long format, and decades as well, depending on how they're expressed in different languages. So as you can see, there's quite a wide range of errors that would be identified by lexiQA. At the end here, you also have a quick reference again for the languages supported in MakeCat. Obviously, I'll come back to this in just a moment to tell you a bit more about where we are in that sense. So basically, this gives you a very quick overview of what happens in MakeCat while taking advantage of this additional feedback that you get for quality assurance, either in a live translation scenario where the project is still being worked on by the translator. You can get these highlights and react on the fly, or in a revision scenario where the translation has already been completed, and then the reviser can just go in and apply corrections. Now, in this kind of workflow, of course, if a translator has used our checks while translating, we would assume that when a reviser picks up this project in MakeCat, there wouldn't be any highlights anymore because the translator would have dealt with them. However, every time, as I said, that a reviser comes in to check something or to add something here, then the moment something happens which is out of place, immediately the QA will kick in. So basically, this live QA functionality ensures that even revisers don't introduce any new errors in the text. So that's an additional layer of security, if you like. So even if no highlights exist in the text that is meant to be revised, more errors could be potentially introduced by the reviser by accident. And with lexiQA running in the background, you can ensure that this doesn't happen. Right, so that's the live demo. Now, I'm going to go quickly back to the presentation just to show you a couple more things before we wrap it up to have your questions. Now, a very quick word about where we are at the moment. So we have in our collaboration with MakeCat, we are fully integrated, which means that by default, if you start a project in MakeCat with any two languages that we happen to support, then you are going to get lexiQA's checks. At the moment, we have 33 working languages in MakeCat, and we're working on a new batch that should be coming in the next week or two. And that includes a couple of languages like Bengali and Tagalog, which we have developed with a very kind support from the good people of Translators Without Borders, which means that all these new languages will be available in Kató as well. So you'd be able to use them there in a live situation during translation or during revision. The error classes that I showed you earlier are quite extensive. Obviously, when there are particular requirements from a client, then we can develop a new check as well, and that will go into production too. Now, there are some things that we do which MakeCat doesn't support in terms of functionality because they support these operations in a different way. So things, for example, like terminology checks or segment level checks like inconsistencies or length checks, spell checking, custom checks, and how you identify and you handle tags. All these are issues that MakeCat handles on its own, and we have a different way of handling those, and we do that in our own editor, which is a completely different environment from MakeCat. And apart from MakeCat, also I should mention that we also have integrations with another 5 online translation platforms. So from our point of view, whoever wants to use lexiQA in order to support their work, whether in revision or even in translation, then this is something that can be very easily done. Now, as far as more information is concerned, MakeCat has a webpage where the integration with lexiQA is explored in more detail. In fact, I can show you this now. And this page here lists, is always up to date with the languages we support, and also explains the various functionalities that are available for you during translation or even when setting up the project. So you can always use this as a point of reference. The second point is that of the community forum, which was mentioned earlier by Marina. So basically at this address, if I jump back here, this is the TWB forum, where we encourage you to join the forum and start a discussion about how lexiQA's checks are performing in the languages that you're using, for example, or if you have any ideas for improvements or additional checks that we could build, then obviously that can be discussed here. Or alternatively, you can also contact us directly, meaning that, if I jump back here, you can use this address to write to us directly and suggest any changes that you might like to see. And after all this, I think I will stop now and see if there are any questions. Thank you. Right. I think we have received a few questions already. So let me go through each of them one by one. Now, when it comes to terminology inconsistencies, this is one question I can see here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, terminology is handled by MakeCat natively, so they have their own import system for glossaries, meaning that when you start a project, you can also upload a glossary along with the file that you want to translate, and any other reference files you might have, like a translation memory, etc. And if there is a problem with any of the terms that were listed in the glossary, then you would get them in this tab here. And here you can even create a new entry, as far as I know. But generally, that would be highlighted in the segment telling you what the problem is. Now, in our editor, we handle things a little differently with different file types, etc. But that's what happens in MakeCat and in Kató by extension. Now, I can see a common question that comes up a few times is that of typos and spell checking. So let me point out, first of all, that MakeCat by default doesn't have a spell checker of its own. So it assumes that when you use MakeCat online in a browser, as we are here, as we're doing here, you also have activated the spell checker in your browser. Now, I understand that this is something that some people might not be familiar with, so I think I'll take a moment to show you this now. So I'm using Chrome at the moment, so I'll show you that first. So in Chrome, you go to Settings, and you scroll down to go to Advanced, and if you go further down, you can see there is a section called Languages, and when you expand this menu, you can basically add spell checking for whichever language you are working with. And that would then underline any potential spell checking errors in your browser, including in MakeCat's environment. So that way you have this additional level of support, if you like. And this is something very easy to do. It takes 3 clicks to do it. Let me also show you the same thing in Firefox. So in Firefox from the menu on the top right. If you click on options, you get to this page that we're looking at the moment. And when you scroll down, you can see there is a section called language. There is an option here that you can tick in order to have spell checking as you type. The only issue that you need to take care of is to choose which language you want to have spell checking for. And as you can see, the menu is quite extensive. And the moment you have this activated, obviously you can have multiple languages at the same time in your menu. So whatever working languages you have, you can have the spell checking activated for all of them. All right, so that should deal with the problem of spell checking, at least with respect to working online. Okay, so here is another question now. The revision option that we're looking at now, is it available only to the reviser or to the translator as well? The answer is it's available to both. So basically, as a translator, you're working in MateCat in a live translation. So you have this project that you're working on. Anything that happens here, you get QA. Now, a reviser who would go over the same project would normally get this link somehow, or it would be communicated through the Kató platform to the reviser, and then they would go in after the translation is done, and they would still be able to use the same checks as before. The same kind of feedback comes back, and they can use that information to apply any corrections. So basically, it can be QA in translation while you type. It can be after the translation has been completed. There's no restriction in that sense as far as MateCat is concerned. Okay, now, another question is, if you correct or choose to ignore an issue, does the correction or choice to ignore it automatically propagate to other identical issues? That's a good question. Now, here, this is something I won't be able to show directly. I can talk over it more than anything else. So let's say here we have this segment. Now, let's assume that this segment had this problem, and it was translated in exactly the same way in other parts of the same document. Now, if I apply the correction here and I delete this punctuation, MateCat here would pick up on this change right after I confirm the translation, and it would come up with a pop-up message here telling you there are other segments in this file which have exactly the same content. Would you like to change the translation in those other segments as well? So it gives you the choice to confirm those changes or to ignore this option and then deal with those segments individually. Generally speaking, this automated approach is a good thing because it saves you time. But at the same time, there might be cases where you want to review each of those segments individually because the decision on whether to change something or not might be context specific. So even if the same problem appears multiple times in the document, it might actually not be a problem in one of them. So generally speaking, that depends on the structure of the document, the source, where it's coming from, etc. The choice is entirely up to you. MateCat would give you the option, though, to apply this change in the content in the target segment in other instances in the same file as well. Okay. Another question is about Hindi and whether we can, whether it's going to be one of the supported languages. Hindi, along with a number of other languages from Asia, are in our roadmap, and we hope to be able to have it developed in the next few months. Right now, as I mentioned, we're working on Bengali, so that would be our first step towards addressing the remaining Indian languages. But we do have another 6 or 7 Asian languages right now, including Korean, Thai, simplified Chinese, and Tagalog that I mentioned earlier, which is almost ready as well. So we're trying to cover as much of a broader area as we can. And certainly when it comes to Asian locales where QA support generally is minimal. Okay, another question is it possible to make it compulsory for translators to ignore or accept corrections? As far as I know, in MakeCut, there's no way you can do that. In other words, you cannot force a change on a person who has access to the file, and they also have read and write rights to the file, meaning that if I have this project link and I apply a change in the segment, I can do it. There's no one that can stop me from doing that. There are some potential workflow exceptions where, for example, you might have a case of a segment that is 101%, meaning that it's an in-context exact match. Now, in those cases, even if you want to apply a change, you wouldn't be able to because the whole segment is completely locked. But in every other case, every segment is editable, and it means that you can go in and apply a change. The only restriction that exists in those cases would have to be basically overseen by the project manager or whoever is the project owner. Okay, next question is about locale-specific dates for Arabic. That is correct, we do have them. The same facility that exists for all the locales, so whatever you saw here for Spanish, applies for all the locales we support, all the languages. Every time we design a new language module, we take into account all the grammatical rules that apply for that language, always in consultation with linguist experts in that particular language. And obviously, the process of improving on the checks that we have for a locale are continuous, meaning that if we get user feedback telling us, you know what, this particular check doesn't seem to be working properly, then we're very happy to follow up and make changes to our algorithms to make sure that the checks are working properly. So a lot of the improvements we do rely on the feedback we get. Now, another question is, to what extent can we customize rules in different language pairs to account for differences in grammar and syntax? And there's an example here about quotation marks, for example. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, in our own proprietary editor, you can also apply your own custom checks in the form of regular expressions. In the case of MakeCut, all the checks that we provide are only the ones we have by default. As far as I am aware, MakeCut doesn't have a facility where you can add your own regular expressions or your own custom checks in any other form. So basically, it all comes down to how substantial those differences might be and whether, for example, the issue that you're trying to address is something that is already being checked for or not by us. So please refer to the QA documentation that I showed you earlier, and you can see what subjects, what particular issues we already cover. Okay, and the last question is about the order of tags. Now, as I said, in MakeCut, tags are basically dealt with internally, so we have nothing to do with the way tags are manipulated or applied in the translation. So I can't really comment on issues of ordering or anything similar, because when it comes to dealing with, for example, the exact position of a tag or the content of a tag, all that comes down to MakeCut itself. lexiQA doesn't have any participation in that process at all. And I think this covers all the questions we've received, unless I am mistaken. I'll pass on to Marina and Anita, and let me know if there's anything else I should add.
Thank you, Vasilis. Anita, do you want to say a few words in closure?
Thank you, Marina. And perhaps I could say thank you for attending the webinar, and in case you have any further questions, we will be glad to answer them. You can always send them to me or Marina or Vasilis. Marina, well, perhaps you would like to say something more about the Kató, our discourse, the Kató community.
Sure. Thank you, Anita. So as I said earlier, we will be making a more general announcement very shortly. But even now, you can already go to the address that you see on the screen. And actually, the part of the forum that you see right now, this is what everybody who's not logged in sees. But if you log in with your Kató workspace account, you should be able to do that. You will be able to see a lot more topics. So Kató community is a new community forum that we're starting. It contains a really large section which we're constantly building on, the Kató Q&A, and that covers all the platforms that TWB is currently using with our community, as well as some topics that are of more general interest. For example, how do I become a volunteer? How do I qualify in different language pairs? What is the translator code of conduct? These sorts of things. So in addition to that, we also plan to make important announcements in the forums. If you log in, you'll be able to access other sections such as the Translator Lounge, a section called Translation Matters, which is where you can ask your questions about quality, make proposals, share with us what worked, and also interact with your colleagues and talk about not only translation quality at TWB, but more generally about your volunteer experience. And we're very closely monitoring the forum, so this is a really good chance for you to also interact with TWB staff and get your questions answered, as well as interact with your colleagues. So stay tuned for the announcements, and even now you can go to the forum and log in with your workspace login. If you have trouble logging into the forum, or if you have any questions and you're not able to post, you can also email us at translatorswithoutborders.org, and we will get back to you. So thank you again, Vasilis. This was really a great intro, and thank you everybody who asked questions. I think we got a fairly good sense of how lexiQA can help us move our quality initiatives forward. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Anita, for organizing this. And as I said earlier, we'll be very happy to receive any other questions in writing and follow up either in the forum or through other channels to ensure that everyone has a pleasant experience, let's say, with lexiQA while using it in Kató. And thank you all for the work you're doing.